people. The university in particular resides on land cared for and called home by the Dakota people for generations. At CTS, we're committed to building and strengthening our ties with our tribal partners. Each nation, and I've learned this through multiple conversations with these partners, have unique transportation priorities and challenges, and we're really interested in continuing to collaborate with those partners. We've worked really closely with multiple tribal nations. One of the videos that you'll see cycling through today and that you can find on our Rural Needs Statewide Answers theme page on our website is focused on a really great project with multiple tribal partners, and Professor Greg Lindsay and the MnDOT Office of Tribal Affairs focused on pedestrian safety on tribal lands, and is a really great, I think, example of the type of work that we've been able to do with those partners. I also want to reaffirm and thank you all for the work that we're all doing collectively to think about how we're addressing historic and contemporary inequities in our transportation network. We know that building a transportation system that works for everyone and helps create a thriving quality of life for all of our neighbors and all of our communities is something that's going to continue through administrations, through shifting priorities, through shifting projects, and that's something that we're delighted to continue to work with you all on and prioritize very highly at the university. Today, if you've been at one of our conferences, we're going to hear a lot about great work in research, great work in engagement and education, policy and advocacy, both in Minnesota and beyond. I am so thankful for all of you who are here as our partners. That's folks from the legislature, from MnDOT, from other public agencies at the state, local, and regional level. I have great gratitude for our members of our executive committee who are here today, also members of the program committee who did a great deal of work helping us sift through really great proposals and get to see some of the projects and research you're going to hear today. You all as partners and collaborators and stakeholders in our work, thank you for being here. Students and researchers from the university, of course, and from other universities across the country. We have a good representation from folks outside of Minnesota today, which is also really exciting. And I also just want to give a huge thanks to our CTS team. I get the pleasure and honor of coming up here and making it look really easy, like lots and lots of months of labor and work haven't gone into this day, and to all of the other efforts that we do at the center. We have an amazing team, and this has been a year of a lot of transitions with new folks on our team, lots of team members retiring who have been here for a long time and thinking about how to continue to evolve our center. We've welcomed many new family members, small family members, members of our CTS team. I was out for several months with some health situations, and I just want to thank everybody on our team for navigating that and doing that with great commitment to one another and support for one another. And it's also a product of how you see these great events come together. So if you wouldn't mind joining me in thanking the whole CTS team for putting this together, that'd be great. Just a note on our two keynote sessions and how they tie into our thematic focuses. You'll notice that for the first time this year, this morning's keynote is going to be focused on our Rural Needs Statewide Answers theme from 2024, which is not, this is not the wrap up of it. It is a great feature of it, but you can check out that website through our research tab on our cts.umn.edu site. We've been doing a lot of great work on that. Again, there'll be a series of videos cycling through today that feature both research and great transportation projects throughout the state. I encourage you to investigate that, and our speaker will also talk about a lot of her great work with rural communities across the United States. And then we're also launching our 2025 theme today with the conference, and this is something that we'll keep going, continue to do in years ahead. It's going to be focused on unpacking freight and thinking about all of the ways that freight touches our lives and how we have it become, how it is a central part of our transportation system and how we can understand those various pathways. And we're going to continue to explore that as we go into 2025 and are excited to do that with you all. And our second keynote speaker will be touching on that and sort of soft launching our 2025 theme. So we're wrapping up 2024, beginning with 2025, and are excited about both of them. And you will also notice in your snazzy programs that we have beautiful demarcations of both of those themes if you are interested in following either the rural needs or the freight theme throughout the conference program today. That's what those logos in your program denote. So please check those out and keep an eye out for the launch of the new theme site in just a couple months here in 2025. Just a few housekeeping things. Also in your program, there's a QR code, I believe, on almost every page that will get you to a session evaluation. We really love to get feedback from you all as you go through the day. This is a new location for our conference. We're interested in everything from the content of the presentations to how the site works for you, and we're really delighted to be at McNamara and hope it works really well for us this year. But please check those out and give us feedback about what you liked about today, what you didn't like, what we can improve. Also in your program, there's a link to our annual impacts report, a great way to summarize a lot of the work that we've been doing at CTS across the year with all of you. Please check that out as well. And then there's also a range on our events page and events calendar on the CTS page if you want to look ahead to other exciting events, including our Freight and Logistics Symposium coming up, focused on AI and freight on December 13th. We'd love to see you there as well. With that, I am very delighted to introduce our morning keynote speaker, Dr. Natalie Villwock-Witte. Natalie is an associate research professor and research engineer at the Western Transportation Institute, one of our peer centers at Montana State University. And over the last 13 years, she's been conducting multidisciplinary research at WTI, focusing on transportation challenges and solutions in rural areas across the country. And in addition, she's a national leader with the Transportation Research Board in her second term as the chair for the Transportation Needs of National Parks and Public Lands Committee. And if you're tied with TRB, you know that committee chairmanship is also a really important and really time-consuming and fun process, so we appreciate her leadership in that as well. So Natalie's going to join us to talk about some of those projects, and then we will be joined by a couple other panelists who I'll introduce when we get to that moment to talk about transportation across Minnesota and some of the work that we are doing here and what we take away from Natalie's talk. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Natalie Villwock-Witte to the stage.
All right. I'm short, if you haven't noticed, so appreciate being able to put the mic at my hike. So, all right. Enter? No. Which one's the down one then? Yeah. Thank you.
Yep.
All right. Good morning. I'm really excited to share with you guys some of the research that I've been able to do the past few years. But before I get into that, there's one thing I want to start with. You know, as I sit and reflect and I'm really humbly able to present to you guys today, I wanted to express gratitude because that kid 20 years ago would not have known that I'd come back. So first of my family for a bachelor's, first for a master's, and only for a PhD. So I was not going to cry, but I'm just really grateful because I get to also share with you the work that I've been able to do and hopefully positively impact some of the communities that we've been working with. So the 4 research projects that I'm going to talk about, one is in Texas, so Deep East Texas Council of Governments Transportation Voucher Program. The case studies of communities of less than 10,000 people with bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. The Active Transportation Workshop in Pennsylvania's Northern Tier, and Supported Mobility in LaBelle, Florida. And as I kind of tell the stories, you'll see how all of these works kind of tied in and related together and built on one another. So the Transportation Voucher Program. In rural areas, it's a different experience. I know I was talking to someone this morning, you know, within kind of the more metropolitan area, but often we find that data and kind of really the basics of mobility is a challenge. I think there's some areas that are able to do a lot more contemporary information, but something like this, which is really literally just identifying people that they can use simple checks and have that as a way to pay someone that maybe they know as a friend, in some cases a provider, to allow them to get to the transportation they need. We're talking about access to grocery stores. We're talking about just going to get your hair done. We're talking about getting to social events. So that's what this particular program was. Why? Because we know that historically, and I know some things have changed, thankfully, you can't use some of those other tools or funding sources to get to groceries. We know that social isolation, and this is kind of where that multidisciplinary work can lead to depression, right? And we want people to experience and have livability of their life, and of course the lack of food choices, especially when we see closures of many of our infrastructure, can lead to obesity and other illnesses, so kind of almost the compounding of it. And so in this particular case, we have all this great digital media, but sometimes in rural areas, the simplest thing is the thing that makes the most sense. So ultimately, what you see on the screen is that check that we had that people would fill out, and this was able to create some of that basic data that, again, in rural areas tends to not exist. So, but why are we focusing on the 5 counties that we had this program ultimately deployed? DETCOG, so again, DP's Texas Council of Governments, they have all these counties that they maintain, and if you recall, Texas is big, right? And the counties that you see outlined in the yellow are some of the most rural, least populous counties within their oversight, right? And more importantly, even though you have these long distances that can be experienced, 6% of households within the broader metropolitan area may not have a vehicle, and it's even higher in one of the communities that the counties we were trying to serve, Jasper at 7.3%. Furthermore, when we look at the representation of people with disabilities, where sometimes maybe that's a little bit more difficult to own and operate one's own vehicle for a variety of reasons, we want to make sure we can provide individuals with mobility within those counties. And looking at household income, so I don't know if you guys have ever heard the statistic from AAA. It's roughly, and it changes a little bit, about $10,000 to annually operate and maintain a vehicle. And that's not at the high end. We know sometimes when we have older vehicles, which tend to be more prominent in rural areas, that can be increased. So when you take that out of that income, how much is left for housing and food, and then think of anything else that might be. And at present, while there are some public transportation options in some of the other counties within DETCOG, within those focus counties, there was no public transportation, and there are some interesting nuances in Texas that I'm not going to get into about that particular aspect. So DETCOG had this on their list of to-dos for years, but their funding source, even though we know there was need that was beyond who we could service, their funding source was the Older Americans Act. Again, this is something where they had provisions of transportation previously, and then basically changes in funding sources resulted where they didn't have this. So they really, for years, wanted to bring an offering back where they could start to identify and address mobility needs of folks within their areas, these select county areas. So to kind of kick the program off based on the funding that was available, they were able to enroll 40 participants, roughly providing about $150 a month. Again, that's like, oh, maybe that's not so bad until you think of the long distances that you're providing, the headways at the beginning and stuff that result in costs if you're using a private provider. So the great thing about the program is it also enables, maybe if you want to ask a family member but not kind of put the burden of costs on them, it's a great way for folks to use this as well. Trips could be used for medical appointments, grocery stores, personal care appointments, bank, post office. Maybe some of you that are familiar with some of these programs can think about what might be the most commonly used trip purpose. Think about that. And then I'll go to the next slide. So it was a little bit of we expected the shopping, so the bright orange, to be something, right? Because a lot of those other funding programs didn't allow for that. But the representation of medical was a little bit of a surprise. And while we did not get to go in the end, and it was not really kind of the purpose, and for a whole host of other reasons, we got a lot of anecdotes from our partners. But you can imagine that maybe sometimes the medical might be appealing if, say, for example, you have to go get cancer treatment, and you don't want to wait for a transportation provider to come when you call them when you're done, which is often required of you. It's a lot kind of from the experiential perspective, right, to be able to go get your treatment and leave immediately and go back to your home and recover. So I don't think it's surprising that we see medical, and in some cases we also know that, historically you couldn't kind of couple. If I went to a medical provider, got prescribed something, I couldn't go to the area and get that, and in some cases, get the prescription that you needed, you then had to go on a separate trip or find a separate trip, right? So that's kind of telling in the sense of what we saw as trip purposes. So DETCOG received the 2019 Excellence in Regional Transportation Awards. I'm really, really excited about that. But I think even more excited in continuing to communicate with our partners at DETCOG. They told us that another regional planning agency actually took a similar concept and applied it within their region to try to provide more mobility for individuals as well. So to me, that is kind of one of the most successful things because we know we're getting people to where they need to go. The next project I wanted to talk about, and I see one of our stakeholders in the room, is the case studies of communities of less than 10,000 people with bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. And this kind of came about of the concept that I often hear in rural contexts, even from my fellow transportation professionals at Tier B and other locations, no one walks or bikes in. You fill in whatever small community people have this viewpoint of. LaBelle is this one. So we'll talk a little bit about, do people walk or bike in LaBelle? So we were able to put together 5 states, roughly representing 5 regions. Why? Because we know if we often do research for one specific state, people are like, oh, no, that's just Minnesota. We can't see that as being similar. But if you have this kind of compilation of different areas, right, it kind of provides a stronger sense that, yeah, people really are walking and biking. The communities that are prioritizing this are able to come up with really cool things, and it's resulted in people walking and biking. So we developed 15 case studies as a result of that. I just want to give you a little idea of how we kind of identify these communities, and again, harken on the really challenges of data availability in rural areas. And I know some folks are like, oh, you can use all these great digital sources. Be aware, digital sources, a lot of times they take one person that's representing the community and they multiply it, right? And so that creates a bias in what people are doing, side note. But for this one, we started out with a list, 10,000 or fewer communities in all 5 states. You can imagine what that list looked like. And then we had a nice gentleman that was essentially interning with us for a while who did queries, simple Google queries about various permutations of pedestrian and bicycle and each of those associated communities. And you saw rise to the top kind of a cluster of communities in each state that might have those examples that we'd really want to focus on. We ultimately then started digging into the communities that were chosen in cooperation with our stakeholders, looked at their plan and documents, created a timeline, identified programs and funding sources that they had used to support what infrastructure they put in place. And we had a goal of interviewing an elected official, because we know they have different viewpoints than planners and advocates, and some wore multiple hats. Ultimately, we conducted site visits within every community. In some cases, rural sometimes, you get a lot of non-response, mainly because, especially as someone that is representing Montana State University, and if I'm reaching out to someone in Minnesota, they're like, why is Montana talking to Minnesota? Because they don't always understand kind of the fact that we might do this national level research. So I would go on site and I would introduce myself to folks and say, hey, can I follow up and can we have this conversation afterwards? Because I'd really like to get your input. And so I think that sometimes when we look at the funders, the valuation of being able to have those personal connections is really important. We took a GIS tool to get locational photos of infrastructure, talked a little bit about data challenges beforehand. There was at least one community where it was kind of touch and go regarding whether or not I could use my cell phone and it had enough connectivity to take those photos, right? It's still an experience in rural that I had to argue with some of our federal partners about, you don't always have that connectivity in all parts of the US, and what does that mean from some of the tools that we use and efforts that we have? So we did develop the case study for those 15 communities. You can find them afterwards, they're still available. And we gave an opportunity for the communities, they weren't required to, but we said, hey, do you want to tell us if we got this right? So, as I mentioned, they had timelines. It was really great to hear some of the communities that did take the time to review it. They're like, in the scheme of things, when we're working on it, we really feel like we're not getting enough done. We wanted to see more success. But the way you put this timeline here, we see the valuation of what we've been able to achieve. It kind of gave them more momentum and ability to say yeah, we've gotten somewhere. Funding examples, even though you may not be able to use the same exact funding examples, especially when we talk about some really local specific examples, you can think conceptually about, okay, well, this local entity, I would have never thought that they might fund bicycle or pedestrian infrastructure or maybe just, places for us to park our bikes. But yeah, that's a good idea. Because we don't all want to just kind of draw from one source. So it was really interesting to see the creativity of how people approach that. Program examples too, just because you put the infrastructure out, when most of us on a day-to-day basis might be more accustomed to driving, we need to encourage people to consider other modes and then they might kind of adopt them, right? So how did people kind of come and create that enthusiasm to use the infrastructure that we can build, right? That's kind of intertwined, but something that we always are challenged with. And then photos, because photos speak louder than anything that I can say, right? If you can see that it's being done, that's different than me saying, oh yeah, this community is putting in a crosswalk across a state roadway or so forth. I did want to talk a little bit about the picture in particular on the right. You can see the young ladies going through this underpass. Maybe some of you have been to Walker, Minnesota, connecting to kind of that nice feature in the community of the lake to more of the residences kind of up the hill. But to do so, you have to go over the state roadway. So this is a beautiful facility. Talking with the advocate in the community, one thing he pointed out, he said, you know, kind of one thing that I'm frustrated or challenged by is there's another crossing that we would love to do, right? We're getting all this use, all these people that are coming to town. We have some older users like myself that it takes us a little while to get started to go across the roadway. You know, I'm like, hey, why can't we put this other crossing similar to this in this other location? And he's like, but someone's telling me that I have to have a statistic. Statistic is I have to have someone severely injured or killed before we can do something like that. And I think that's one of those challenges as transportation professionals, especially when we look in rural areas and we don't have that high density network that we see in urban areas, which is still something I think there's an evolution of change of how we're looking at that. We need to think differently about what can we use as data-driven justification for projects like this that can really create a fundamental different experience for the user without having to severely injure or kill someone, right? A more proactive approach. And just to show you, kind of harken back to that, no one walks or bikes in LaBelle. I was only in each community for about a day, maybe a half on the beginning and the end, depending on how travel went between each of these communities when I was in each state. This is just 10 of the 15. Every one of those little blobs, and you can check them out there at the back end of all the case studies if you want to see, represents someone I saw in that short period of time walking or biking. And again, this is often when I'm kind of walking around, collecting data in the community. I would also kind of collect this information. So you can imagine that, you know, as I'm going into the community, maybe I saw someone who were walking and biking, but I'm not capturing that as well. So my point here is there's a lot of people that are walking and biking in rural areas, and we really need to think about how we're designing and implementing infrastructure for rural areas. I think one of the exciting outcomes, I always like to talk about kind of that tech transfer of what we do as researchers. The regional entity within which Silver City was part of was willing to kind of lead the charge for the bicycle-friendly application, really putting the small community on the map. And they were awarded the bronze level. And we also provided some of the data that we did as part of this to support their application. And then more importantly, when I was looking at this list, getting ready for this presentation, I was excited to see Calvert City, another community that we worked with, and we had talked about these variety of things, and we were asking questions about bicycle-friendly communities. And I know the lady in that community was like, oh, she's like, what's bicycle-friendly communities, right? Just the process of talking with them, they're now on the map as someone, and they have incredible infrastructure within the small town in Kentucky, and actually connect to one of their regional parks. So I think there's all these benefits that we have from working with our communities. I also took the opportunity to present this topic on the Physical Activity Policy Research and Evaluation Network, PAPRIN World Work Group. So this is me trying to think outside my little engineer box to think of other folks that, you know, are partners, allies in what we're trying to do. And so as a result of that, Sam, which you'll see here in a second, was like, you know, I've been wanting to offer these active transportation workshops in Pennsylvania's northern tier. Can we use the content that you developed as kind of some of the basic information that we can disseminate, because it's rural specific, which we often don't see. Pennsylvania's northern tier, yes, Pennsylvania is one of our East Coast states, so you would think that there's a lot of really high density aspects of it, but this northern part of it, so Kane is in the center. That's actually where we ultimately deployed this particular workshop. But another one that we then did after in Mansfield, to get there, it was a multiple-hour flight for me, followed by a 4-hour drive because of the twisty turniness of the road, right? There's not direct roads in some of these rural places of the US that I think we don't always kind of think about. Really want to emphasize the project partners that put this on, right? It's not nearly as effective if, as a researcher, I want to come in and say, I'm going to disseminate this active transportation workshop, because as a part of working with the Kane Area Development Center, so the economic arm of the local community, our regional planning entity, the planning director of a county, our advocates at PA Route 6 Alliance, we're able to think differently about it and get this done from the end of February and offering it mid part of May. And again, so numbers too in rural areas, I want to talk about, 30 people registered. Super excited about that. For a rural area, for people that have so many other hats during the day, this is really, really successful for rural, right? And it's getting that information out there. So as a part of kind of the planning process, through that, we met almost weekly through that duration. The ongoing related efforts, we understood what was going on in the communities by talking with our local partners, so we kind of made sure we could resonate with what they were hearing and then build on that as well. We talked about the ideas of in-person, virtual, or hybrid, but again, since this was our first offering, we really wanted to keep it simple. We talked about various locations that we could offer the workshop. Kane, Pennsylvania is really, really small. 3,560 people, but they had this incredible facility you can kind of see on the top left. Brand new build, really great kind of modern technology that allowed us to really kind of host that event. We drafted presentations, as I mentioned. We drew the information from that earlier project and kind of created the module on infrastructure, on connections, on programs, and then had people comment on it and made it more local specific based on the feedback that we got through that cooperation. We also added on bike rides at the beginning and the end, an e-bike demo so that we could kind of think about, future kind of opportunities. And then we talked about who might do the introduction. Do we want an elected official or someone else? We evaluated it because we knew that Sam wanted to continue to offer these workshops in the future, and how can we improve, right? Even if we think what we come up with is great and then some, I always know there's room for improvement, even though I'd like to say it's the best, but I think there's always opportunities that I can do something even better. And then partners contribute as able. It wasn't you're required to come and contribute this. It was like, okay, we have this, this, and this that we need. What's reasonable for you to come and contribute? And so everybody kind of came to the table with what made sense to them. In some cases, it was printing documents. In some cases, it was providing the food. In some cases, it was renting the venue for us. When we did event marketing, and I think there's smarter people than me that can really think about how to do this, but I like to listen to them. We started out with things that we use in our kind of transportation terms of active transportation, right? We started out with alternative transportation, but mobility is another thing we like to throw around. And talking with our partners, they're like, well, if you use mobility, people are gonna think that you're talking about physical, like physical therapy, right? Was an interesting kind of feedback. If you do something simple like walk, bike, and roll, you're kind of communicating more with people with kind of what our focus are, because we wanted to engage not just our leadership within the other thing, we also wanted to make it open to the public, right? Because if you kind of can find that public champion or someone that's really passionate about it, they can kind of drive things in local communities, these rural communities, through to the end line and get things done, as you heard from the earlier advocate I talked about. So again, 30 attendees. We use Menti to evaluate it. I don't know if you've seen Menti. It's kind of a really online thing where you can ask feedback for people. Had a little pushback on that too, because again, it's technology. Some people are more amenable and open to it than others, just FYI. Talked about infrastructure, so what do bicycle and walk-in facilities look like? Funding sources, which people are super enthused about, but we'll talk about that in a second, what that means. The bicycle-friendly programs, they actually did one through the local entity in addition to League of American Bicyclists, so kind of different components of it. Connections, what it means to not just put like a bike lane in or a bike facility in, but also connecting it to the places that people want to come from and go to. And then, of course, those supporting programs that I mentioned earlier. So I think this is another thing, too, as a researcher, really trying to think about not just this one and done. I think sometimes the most horrible word that I hear from a researcher's perspective is helicopter researching, but continuing to think about how we can take this as just one thing that contributes to what we can do in the future, right? And they already had the Trail Town workshop that they were doing then after, so continue that conversation. There's an opportunity through working with their state basically LTAP entity to continue to offer other programs and build on what was discussed and continue kind of that discussion points. And then funding opportunities, as I mentioned, people really, really were interested in them, but they're still intimidating, and not in what you might think in this one. The regional council for this particular area actually is willing to write grants, but just having that match, which was identified as something that was essentially required, is intimidating for a lot of our small rural communities. And then, of course, programs and partnerships, people are kind of least familiar with thinking kind of what those might be. And one thing I want to point out, again, in these photos here, you can see the gentleman in the top, but you might have seen the circle come up there. When we were doing the case studies, and even in this community, which was outside of kind of that work, saw a multitude of people with disabilities using these mobility devices, but on the roadway, right? Because when you, don't create space, but even thinking about the space that we're creating, and sometimes in how we design, at least here in the US, we tend to like to put that up and down, which can be jarring for some folks. So thinking about how we're accommodating and designing for the users that we have in communities, I think is really, really important. So finally, again, LaBelle is one of the communities as a part of the ones, and in the process of reviewing their documents, we said, you have this information where you're interested in pursuing. It was actually, they want to do a bike share. They have a dock, which I'll show here shortly, and it can connect into the community because when people come on boat, they dock there, they don't have cars, right? So how are you gonna get in a community? You can walk and you can bike. And we also knew that people were, again, walking and biking in this community, so using things, even though there's nothing really to support them here, but this is kind of where they're going through, right? So I'm mentioning, or kind of the highlight you might have seen, I like to think, okay, so these are crashes. Do you guys start to see a pattern? This is something that my colleagues and I were kind of debating about. I mean, what do you think is the pattern? And look at the bicycle and pedestrian crashes, which are the bigger dots you can kind of see. So when you overlay that on the roadway, and we talk kind of nationally about reconnecting communities, even though I know the focus to some degree is more of the urban areas, you can see the preponderance of the existence of bicycle and pedestrian crashes as tied with the state roadways, right? We know, kind of thinking back to the Walker example, often high speed, large vehicles, much more traffic going through, right? And what does that mean for people that are trying to, within a community, get past what might be seen as a barrier otherwise? And how can we think about our designs and making sure it's safe for people? And I show you this. This is one of those locations and stuff within the community. You can see the lady with the 2 children trying to walk across a state roadway. But more importantly, I think what's most concerning is when we see examples like this, where the man is clearly in the sidewalk trying to get across. We have 3 separate vehicles, so 3 separate drivers that are still not yielding. And so how can we think about and design and understand that we have these issues and challenges in rural communities, not just state roadways, but of course, because we're sending a lot of traffic through in high volumes and large vehicles, we need to think about how we're going to design to make sure that people do have that yielding mechanism. And we see other evidence of kind of issues with kind of, impacts. Thank God, hopefully there was no pedestrian there. Not sure if the vehicle went off of it or on it, but regardless, seeing tire tracks like that is a bit concerning, especially in the narrow vicinity of, this is kind of, you can see some of the historic buildings in the community. So again, you see the Caloosahatchee River. The top part is where there's the dock. And working with our stakeholders and, just kind of realizing what the stakeholders, what their perspectives and what might be the broader perspectives, I can tell you there's more in this community that we could have addressed from a walking and biking perspective, but this is kind of working with our partners and understanding their needs and desires. There is a project that's going to go in, so that large bridge street that you see in the center is currently the state roadway, and with the redesign, there's a proposed kind of doing a secondary one of having 2 lanes because of growth in traffic that they're predicting. So we wanted to capture some of the existing people walking and biking, and you'll see a little bit of kind of the predominance of movements as I show some future graphs here. So we put out tools that we were able to bring remotely. We can talk about, there's great examples of state DOTs and even regional entities that provide tools that you can use to, really quantify the number of people walking and biking communities. I know Minnesota has a lot of great efforts in that. Not every state always has that. The one on the left, you can kind of see it's overlooking actually the river if you would sit and look towards the bars. The one in the center, so one thing we kind of found out is even though we had done this installation remotely in New Mexico, the trees that were used for the poles were substantially larger, and our brackets when we went out initially to put them in didn't fit. So we tried a different location, and when we kind of tested that from a data perspective, we saw a lot of occlusion and other issues, so we moved it to a different location that our partners were interested in when we were able to get those other tools that we need, but there's kind of nuances associated with it. So it's a tool that we had available, but we can talk if you ever want to about kind of the benefits and drawbacks of these tools. So the data, researchers, we always like to look at data and see what that data is telling us because no data tool is perfect, right? We knew that the spike, they actually have something that's called the Swamp Cabbage Festival, brings about 30,000 people into the community at the end of every February. Pretty big deal for a community of like less than 10,000 people. But why are these other spikes occurring? So in talking with our stakeholders, they were able to identify essentially other issues and events, but we cleaned that, and I'll come back to that in a second. And I think as we kind of build on this knowledge and information in rural areas, it's interesting to see that you have both essentially an AM and PM peak, but you have also that center day for this one location, right? And think in relative proximity how close these areas are. Whereas the Fort Thompson one, you'll see that shift in the later part of the day and really kind of higher volumes in the evening, which is not to be unexpected because, again, we have businesses and restaurants and whatnot that are there. So just kind of looking at the different kind of behavior of the data that we're seeing, again, very small amounts of data when we compare it to presented recently, and someone was from Montreal, Canada, right? Their numbers blew ours out of the water, right? So it's a different experience and different influences of what we have when we do have these counts that are erroneous and what that means in a rural environment. So ultimately, in the end, this allowed us to say, okay, we had this many bikes per day, we didn't count it at Fort Thompson and the other locations, so we could come up with kind of that estimate of what it currently was. But again, going back to that tool discussion, right, these are screen line counts. We knew that with the tools we were going, this just has to be acknowledged. These are always questions you should ask of researchers or otherwise. What is that data measuring? What isn't it measuring? And realizing that individuals like this, who might be biking from our boats and so forth, might not be counted as a part of this, right? So can you build on top of that with other tools and kind of create proxies? It wasn't the objective of this particular technical assistance project, but these are things to be considered. And then knowing that we had people using these facilities that were maybe kind of for walking and biking across the river, right? They had an impact earlier, so thinking back to that right spike that we're talking about, where they actually closed the one side of that river access going from one part to the other. And again, DeSoto, when you go across, is just over the river and looking on the other side of the river. So as a result of this and their closure of that, we started to see a difference in behavior, where normally there's a lot of residences in the top part. People will walk across and come on and then go into that more local roadway. Because of that closure, I actually observed people walking across the state roadway on the other side, going around, because they could duck to the left and go under past where our counter was. So that spike that we saw was actually something that we understood later that could potentially be influenced by that movement by folks. So just some things to highlight from LaBelle, as we look at kind of quantifying what it looks like in these small rural communities. You saw the difference in time variations, even though they're in relative proximity, but it just kind of shows that there's a lot more kind of things going on in rural areas than I think sometimes maybe we simplify it as. Tools are useful like these counts, but they may undercount the true value, so just keeping aware of what we are counting. The stakeholders are really important to help explain irregularities and working with them and understanding to get kind of the best information that we can. And rural practitioners, they had so many things going on, water main breaks, other issues going on in the community. They were really excited to work with us to help quantify this so that they didn't have to play with all the things that we learned in the process of installing these tools. And I know in some cases we can have mid-regional councils that will help out with some of these, but oftentimes rural areas, it's a challenge to add that on to already what people are trying to do. Another thing that I wanted to kind of bring to the forefront is when we talk about rural and we're using these tool accounts, we have other sidewalk users, not really legal, but they still occur, like a moped user, and golf carts. And now if you think golf carts are just specific to Florida, I want to share this gem from a community that will remain nameless in Minnesota with a little boy hanging off the back. And so just thinking about kind of what that means from the data that we might collect, and also how we can quantify this and understand the variety of users for these particular facilities that we put in place. And then want to introduce a little bit of something that's currently on my mind. And one thing I want to make sure I'm pointing out is the data, and you can see a link in the PPT. I believe they'll be sharing it. But the main point is the number of ATV fatalities on roadways is just growing, right? You see some kind of down, which we always see with crash data and stuff, and that's concerning, right? From another data source, so 2 different data sources, but it's the way it helps me kind of quantify and show, Minnesota, out of all the states in the US, ranks 15th for OHV-related fatal incidents. So there's a little bit nuance between which 2 ones we're talking about, and I want to acknowledge that, but I was trying to kind of show that basically when I was looking at the data, the state DOT we're working with was lower in the end, and so I noticed, because I always look at states that I've worked with or I've lived in and see where they rank in some of these lists. And I think kind of notably is when we look at strategies, which there's been a lot of emphasis in trying to address the mortality of our youth on these vehicles. So I think you see some benefits in this sense. I might kind of hazard a guess that pretty orange line, I like where it's going, that it's going down, right? But this is proportional. This is the overall proportion of it. And what's concerning that is, on the flip side, we're seeing a lot of 50-plus individuals that are contributing to that reduction that we're seeing in the other one. So, how can we do this? Because if we're thinking about kind of that towards 0 deaths, right, which I think is always the best goal. No one wants to be that statistic that I talked about earlier. How can we make sure that this is not going to be something, an issue, whether it's for our children or whether it's for our peers? And I share that because, again, I live in the metro area, and this is a gentleman that I saw that is exhibiting everything we don't want to do for ATVs. We don't want to have a child in our arms when we're on our ATV. We don't want to be without a helmet. And honestly, unless we have to, we really don't want people on our roadways because the vehicles just frankly aren't designed for it. So kind of in closing, hopefully some of the takeaways that you might have, work with your locals. Whether you're the state agency, whether you're a researcher, whether you're, kind of various entities, want to work with the locals and integrate them into our processes. Make connections, on site, in the local thing, take the time to reach out to folks and try to have that connection. Be curious, again, kind of going back to the beginning, try to be humble and ask questions of people and have them tell me instead of me telling them. And I'm sure I still fail, but it's my continuous pursuit in what I'm trying to do in any community that I work in. There are limited resources in rural, whether it's time that people have to dedicate to these opportunities, whether it's the funding that they have available, whether it's the data that we have to understand and quantify the problems and help show how we're addressing them. But innovative sometime in the rural context, transportation voucher program that I presented at the beginning is not something that I think is like autonomous vehicles, right? But it is impactful for them, it is a practical solution for them, it is something that gives them the basis for building on, even if it's just showing the data of where some people are trying to get from and to within their community. And the importance of technical transfer, right? Trying to do, anytime I work on these research projects, to share what I have, learn from others, and see if we can continue to move the needle in providing better mobility for folks that live in our communities. So with that, I'm gonna say questions.
All right. Is that going? Can you guys hear me? That one's not going, is it? Is it going now? There we go. All right. Well, thank you, Natalie. I'm going to ask Ryan and Kathy to join us here. And as they come up, I'm going to introduce them as well. Oh, those mics were hiding. Good. I thought we were going to have to play past the mic. They're up here. So joining us on stage today, we also have Ryan Daniel, who is the CEO of St. Cloud Metro Bus and also the president of the Minnesota Public Transportation Association. So thank you, Ryan, for joining us, and also a member of the CTS Executive Committee.
And also Dr. Kathy Drager, who is the statewide director of the Regional Sustainable Development Partnership, a group that's been working really closely with CTS on our Empowering Small Minnesota Communities project. And RSDP is a part of the Minnesota Extension. And Kathy is also an adjunct assistant professor within the U of M Department of Agronomy and Plant Genetics. So we're really glad for both of you to join us today and join in conversation with Natalie about some of the work that she's been doing and you all have been doing, and talking some more about how we're working with rural and smaller communities and connecting across the state. So thanks to all for bringing those perspectives. Natalie, thanks for your great presentation and sharing some of those case studies. You highlighted one of my favorite types of multimodality, the boat to bike transition. I think I've joked with several people in this room about yet doing my kayak to bike, all shared mobility commute from South Minneapolis to the university, but one day it's going to happen. I'm going to make it. I'm going to make the plan, and I'm going to do it. So I loved highlighting that in the Florida context, so thank you for doing that. Ryan and Kathy, I'm wondering if we could start with you two kind of responding to what you heard from Natalie's presentation, if there's anything that really resonated with you, sort of similar efforts or similar lessons you've had in working with the communities you've worked with, and really just maybe sharing some similar examples to your experiences of bringing transportation or working with other projects of research and efforts with communities across the state. Kathy, would you mind starting us?
All right. Good morning. Looks like I get to start. So thank you, Natalie. Yeah, that was very interesting, and I really appreciate your challenges and recommendations. A few things. The Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships, we were formed by the Minnesota legislature actually in the late 90s, part of a movement that actually spawned a lot of sustainable development organizations and programs around the state at that time. And we were created to create university community partnerships, which is what I appreciated hearing about the examples that Natalie gave. Because especially in rural Minnesota, and I will say the regional partnerships was designed to work outside of the metro area. So we work in 5 regions of the state, none of which are metro, because there was a sense that there was a need to bring university ways of knowing and expertise to work together with rural communities. Not just on their problems and their issues, which obviously, we can see, especially in areas like transportation, but also on the innovations that they have and the ideas that they have, and how when we work together with different ways of knowing, community grassroots ways of knowing, and university and other ways of knowing, that we can kind of leapfrog some potential barriers and get to those practical solutions that Natalie was advocating for. So, I have a lot to say about how we can build those community university partnerships. I saw at least one extension colleague in the room. I don't know, do we have any other extension folks in the room? Anyone? So one extension colleague. So the University of Minnesota has extension staff in all 87 counties of the state. In addition, we have 15 regional offices. There is an opportunity to build those connections with our extension service around the state to help to advance this connection that we need with community in order to both understand their needs and take advantage of whatever innovations are coming that are place-based. So with that, is that good?
Thank you, Kathy. And my line about his extension as a relatively new Minnesotan is just an extension I trust. So if I have a question about my apple tree, I know where to go. If I have a question about EVs, I know where to go. Ryan, same question to you. Anything that resonated particularly from Natalie's talk, and sharing maybe some examples from your work?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Kyle. And I'll say once again, wonderful presentation. And I'll start by saying where transportation goes, the community grows. And I saw that evident throughout Natalie's presentation. The one slide that stuck out to me the most in relations to Metrobus and what we're doing for our community was when you talked about the reported trip purpose slide. When you saw the citizens in the community utilizing, they're going to school, medical appointments, and work. But the two that stood out to me was the medical appointments and social activities and work. Now, in St. Cloud, we have the biggest medical hub in central Minnesota known as CentraCare. where we have people from outside of St. Cloud, outside of our communities, coming into our communities to utilize medical services. Now, at St. Cloud Metrobus specifically, as a result of COVID, and similar to other industry partners throughout the nation, just not here in Minnesota, we're experiencing a decline in ridership. We're experiencing a decline in a lot of our services. We took that opportunity to look at our existing bus network and said to our team, how best can we meet the needs as a result coming out of the pandemic? So now people are not commuting to the cities as much. People are not going to the office as much. People are reverting to a hybrid environment. So we have most of our ridership now are doing everything from home. So now the travel patterns change. So how can we grow our community if the ridership patterns change? So we took that opportunity to say, hey, how best can we connect our communities? How best can we get people from St. Cloud to Sartell or Way Park to Sauk Rapids in an efficient manner? Not in an hour, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 15 minutes. How do we have increased headways? How do we introduce microtransit? How do we increase on-demand transit? How do we enhance our dollar ride paratransit services? Because we know that there's a need because we have a lot of people who are going to the medical facilities to get the cancer treatments. They're going for medical appointments. They're going for care. How can we best embrace that need? How best can we adapt to that change? And how best can we present a new redesign that people would love to ride? Because our goal is to grow our community. Our goal is to connect the community because with transportation goals, the community grows. So we are in the process now of doing a bus redesign. We took the entire bus network, we tore it apart, and we said, this is what we want to accomplish. And we list the goals that we want to accomplish because the number one goal is how do we connect our communities efficiently? We want people back on our services. We hired a consultant and we took it's an 18-month process and we're at the tail end of that process. But I'd just like to talk a little bit about how we went about the process. Because once again, this is a community effort. The community are the users of our product and we want to have the community involved. We had stakeholder meetings. We reached out to all of our businesses. We reached out to our nonprofit agencies, our social service agencies. We reached out to the schools. We reached out to everybody in our community in the 5 cities that we operate in and said we would like for you to have a seat at our table. Our first stakeholder session, we had over 100 people at our meeting from various walks of life in that room, representing every different mode from Centricare, from businesses, New Flyer, Marco, Coburn, St. Cloud State University, St. Cloud Technical Community College, and even our own employees. Because this is the ownership that they want to have. This is the community's service. And we are here for the community. So it was an exciting process just to see that we had the 5 stakeholder meetings throughout this process. And each stakeholder meeting, the crowd got bigger and bigger. The ideas became more robust. We had great conversations. We actually said to the team in the room, the stakeholders in the room, you guys tell us what services you want to see. You guys tell us where you want the bus to go. You tell us what hours. The businesses, you tell us what shifts are the peak shifts that you want to have the bus services, have frequent service come to your location. And these are all the things that we did just to ensure that we don't leave nobody behind. Because we want to make sure that transportation is accessible to everyone. And by doing the stakeholder meetings, by getting the community involved and seeing the results of the community coming to the table, having these discussions, seeing the excitement of, oh my gosh, I'm actually a part of this because I know I'm a user and I'm going to benefit from this service, my voice is heard. So really exciting times, and when I saw your slide, it just resonated with me because I'm like, wow, same script, different cast in St. Cloud, and I love it. So thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. And I'm wondering to all of you too, I think Ryan, your comments are leading right into this, and Natalie, you've touched on this, and Kathy, I know you and I have talked about this as well. Could you tell us a little bit more about how, in your experience, approaching sort of either, I loved your line about innovation takes many forms, and in some smaller rural communities, it might be a very practical solution, might be something that they've been doing in St. Cloud for years, and it's a new practice, it's a new innovation for a small community, just as much as it might be a new technology or a new mode. I'm particularly curious as you guys talk about engaging with communities and learning with communities. I also love the ways of knowing. I'm going to
steal that from you. What have been some of your learnings about how to bring sort of a conversation around a new practice or a new technology or a new process to a community that maybe has either not thought about that as being a possible application for them, or is wary of it, or says, that's not going to be a solution for us? I mean, I think many people in this room have been working on EVs. I think that's a great example of sort of like, is that a technology that'll work for us? But I think a similar set of questions around even just biking in a small community. And Natalie, maybe we can start with you. Are there other things that you would pull out of, as you've started those conversations, how have you approached that? How do you start that level setting? How do you learn with folks what they're open to or interested in? What's that looked like for you?
Okay. So I'll say, I think the one interesting thing in rural is, I know there are some communities, even with part of the case studies that we approached to be part of it, and they just honestly weren't interested. So I think you also have to be patient too, in the sense that in how our culture is, you can introduce things and you can reach out and have that offering, but you also have to be respectful of the fact that maybe it's not going to work that time. And so I think one of the things that we found to be successful too is that's kind of going back to working with the peers. Right? So maybe that community is not amenable the first time, but maybe their neighboring community is interested in it. And sometimes working with them, they kind of see what's going on. They're like, oh, well, we missed out the first time. We're actually now interested. We now start to see what that is. So I think sometimes also having patience, but not checking people off the list just because they didn't jump in that first time. And just understanding that, some people's level of jumping in, I think of even my two kids, my older one, he'll jump first and kind of figure it out in the end. My other one's like, I kind of want to feel the room first, right? And so I think just being respectful of that and understanding that you might have to work in different timelines and different paces, kind of one of the things is important.
Yeah, nothing is more motivating than competition amongst peers, right? Oh, they did it. I want that too. Kathy, all right, thoughts on that one?
So, and one of the other things I think about working with rural communities, we have someone in Extension, his name is Ben Winchester, he's a rural sociologist, and one of the things that he found is in a metro area, you need around 1% of your population to staff, the school board, the planning and zoning, the different pieces of infrastructure that you have in place that need community, that need the community involvement. In rural places, that can be as much as 20% of the population. So one of Natalie's challenges was about the capacity that you find in rural places. And sometimes that is just that everybody is really busy because, they're hosting the 4-H club, and then they're on the planning and zoning, and, they're just spread really thin in their locations. So how we show up in those communities as a partner, I think is important as well, with acknowledging that sometimes the limited capacity is not just resources, but it's actually the time that the community members have to put in place. I've worked on some projects, some large federal projects, where one of the solutions that we had was to make sure that we were supporting so that all those community stakeholders were able to show up. And we actually worked with the Initiative Foundations, if you're familiar with that. They're part of, McKnight found those a few decades ago to provide philanthropic support in greater Minnesota. But we worked with them to make sure that at our community meetings, we actually had a proportion of people who represented youth, who represented the various communities that we have in our regions. And then we also provided support to them. We provided honorariums, mileage, so that those people, regardless of their financial status, were able to attend these meetings, whether that meant putting their kids in daycare or making some arrangements. We rarely do on-site daycare because, as a university, the protection of minors is something that we do, but it's a little more difficult. So actually providing honorariums so that people can arrange for their own daycare, we found to be a better solution. But in this case, we actually wrote those into our grant proposals. We actually wrote into our grant proposal that we were going to support community members to show up in these stakeholder meetings. And that's actually a best practice that we've used since the inception of this program, the RSDPs. So that would be another example of how we can achieve that.
And I'll just take a second to talk about a project that we started here quite some time ago. And before I talk about the project, just a little backstory. So I'm not from Minnesota. I'm originally from New York City, born and raised in New York City, and I spent some time working at New York City Transit, 9 years exactly, and then I worked in Washington, D.C. Metro for 5 years before coming to St. Cloud. So transportation, for me, I started out as a bus operator. So you think of Ralph Cramden, honeymooners, driving down Times Square. That was me about 24 years ago doing that. And transportation was a way of life. Then you come to Minnesota, like Natalie mentioned about culture. So in New York City, transportation is something that you just do. You get on the bus, you get on the train, you take it wherever you have to go. But then when I came to St. Cloud, transportation wasn't a way of life to the level of it, the way it was in New York, Washington, D.C., or any other big city, any big metropolitan city. So one thing that we did at Metrobus, how do we encourage the use of public transportation? How do we let people know that it's safe to ride our buses? It's safe to utilize paratransit. It's safe to utilize North Star. It's safe. Because when you watch TV, you watch the news, oh, I'm not sending my kid on a bus to go to school in Chicago or Boston or LA, but you could do it in St. Cloud. And I had to wrap my mind around it because those are things that I take for granted. Just, hey, just get on the bus, it's easy. You just do this, do that, get on the bus, no problem. Take 30 minutes. But here is not the case. So what we did in St. Cloud Metrobus, we created a travel training facility. And we're the first system, or the only system in the state of Minnesota to have a facility where we actually teach the community how to utilize our services in a safe environment. Not just dollar ride, we also do our dollar ride assessments in this facility as well, but also the fixed route. We also have a mock bus where we teach people how to read the destination sign, how to pay the fare, if you're in a mobility device, how to utilize the ramp, how to utilize the securement, how to read the signs. Assessment course, we have grass and uneven surfaces to test people's strength to go up and down a ramp, just like if you're in a shopping mall or you're in a parking lot or on the sidewalk. And then we have 2 traffic signals that simulate a 4-lane highway. So if you're able to cross from this side of the room to the other side of the room in 30 seconds, just like if you're out here in a traditional street corner, you could do it out in the public. So we have this environment where we do this because we feel it's important. We talk about the community connection. We talk about how to connect communities. Where transportation goes, the community grows. But we have to make sure that the people understand how to use the services. Ensure that services, let them know, reassure them that the services are safe. One of our St. Cloud State University and St. Cloud Technical Community College, our biggest ridership are international students. Student users are international students. And they come to St. Cloud, they come to the United States for the first time, and they settle in St. Cloud, Minnesota. So riding a bus, if they never rode a bus in their country before, if they just used to driving or walking or biking and they never used transportation, just think about, oh my gosh, how do I figure out how to read the schedule? Is the bus going to be on time? Do I stand at this corner? Is it this side? Do I take the 5? Do I take the 1? Do I take the 3? So you just think of how daunting it could be. For you and I, it may be just easy because we're just used to it, but just think about a student who's coming here for the first time. So having this facility and letting it be the community's facility, that kind of breaks the barrier. It makes it easier for students, users, citizens alike to utilize our services. And then to take it a step further, we actually created a community outreach department. So this community outreach department is tasked with not only ensuring the use of our facility, but to also go out in the community and work with the Initiative Foundations, the United Ways, the Catholic Charities of the world, work with the other businesses to ensure that if transportation is a barrier, we want to remove that barrier, and how can Metrobus remove that barrier in our community through the work of our Community Outreach Department. And then in addition to that, we actually created a Riders Advisory Committee, where we have a group of folks who represent our users who utilize our services that represent the community sit on this board. And we meet once a month just to go over Metrobus operations, dollar ride, what can we do better? Because we have a product, but we could always enhance our services. because we never want to settle for the status quo. We always want to embrace, we want to enhance. How can we be the best? How can we keep up with industry best practices? And we like to do that through our users because they're out there every day utilizing our services. So this is how we embrace the community. This is how we bring the community to the table. And this is how we utilize our outreach, our community outreach facility and our community outreach department in the community.
Thanks, Ryan. That's great. And I think that importance of the navigation side of that, I'm working with somebody right now through one of the other centers of health and aging here on the university who's trying to come up with a solution for elders in her community whose first language is not English, and thinking just specifically about how to navigate some of the transit information and just the simple questions of, does this bus go where I need it to go, and is this the right one, and how do I confirm that? So I love that training idea and that learning that you're doing there. Thanks. Natalie, something that resonated with me as well from your work, and that I think you did a nice job kind of weaving together all these case studies, was just how nicely they build on one another. And I think, Ryan, your last point tied to that too, of like, we don't want to stop working with these communities, right? Or we don't want to say like, job's done here, good luck. I think you did a really nice job sort of highlighting how the research can build on one another and move into that sort of tech transfer implementation piece. I'm wondering specifically, Natalie and Kathy, from your perspectives as researchers and folks connected to the university, can you just talk a little bit more about how you see that work evolving into the future? What are you seeing as some of our biggest opportunities as university researchers and partners with our communities? What are you excited about? Where are you thinking?
Well, didn't you just love Natalie's phrase that we don't want to be doing helicopter researchery? If I got that correct. Because we don't just want to bop in and bop out. And again, I mean, one of the reasons that I appreciate the work that I'm able to do, and also just, I live in Big Stone County, Minnesota, which is about 200 miles west of here, and it is a really remote and rural place. So having the presence of the university, and I know that we're representing a wide group, including our state agencies, which it's also applicable, but that we don't just want to bop in and bop out, that we need to have stable portals that exist between communities and our agencies or organizations. And so I think that we do have some infrastructure for doing that, like the regional partnerships, like extension, like other programs. So I just would say, creating those stable portals that continue to keep those relationships active and obvious and available to rural communities is, I think, part of what would make success in building those partnerships.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I do sometimes, right, you talked about how I sit on TRB, so I have this ability and this luxury of kind of seeing things on a national level. So one of the things that I try to take in opportunities with communities that I've worked with, even ones that I haven't gone more in depth of, when I hear of opportunities, especially as we know of the variety of funding sources, in some cases I'll reach out, I'll say, hey, this is a funding source you might want to consider. This is something you can look at. Just want to make you aware of it, especially from what I heard from working with you. So I try to be a conduit to do that extra step. I mean, we have nowadays a lot of really good resources that people can kind of query into, but I think that's a different experience than having someone that sends a direct email. So kind of going that extra step. And I have to say, sometimes we get in the busy of every day, so I'm not perfect, but that is kind of a goal that I have for myself to really, and also think in terms too, right? I think we have capacity even from our own perspective, and sometimes I know there's other great people and other great programs that I've met over time, and I try to put them in connections with those individuals too, because they might have expertises that maybe are more applicable to the community, and they can provide that next step of technical support. So I think thinking back to one of the examples of the workshop where we had this kind of time capsule. We knew that there was the other trail kind of workshop that was going to be done and building on it, but also connect them to the LTAP with the hope that they can kind of continue that discussion, but also draw from other sources too. So, if those people have the ability to connect or have more of the direct thing. So thinking of different ways of that, but realizing that, I'm not the only resource. There's many, many other ones out there, and can I be a conduit to connect you with that?
Thanks, Natalie. And several of you guys have mentioned sort of the difficulty and range of connecting funding sources and identifying funding sources. I think this is particularly true, and many of the folks in this room know this across rural transportation, but many other sectors as well. We had a great panelist at a recent Governor's Advisory Council on Connected and Autonomous Vehicles talking about some of the challenges that you highlighted as well, Natalie, with the different waiver programs and people having access to that and understanding how to weave those things together. I'm wondering if you all could talk a little bit about both what are some of the unique partnerships you've developed and sort of who are actors either in transportation or outside of that that you thought, I'm coming to this community, here's the program we're going to do, I know who my stakeholders are, right? I think both Kathy and Natalie have both mentioned sort of like the multiple hat wearing situations for many folks in rural communities. Who have you found to be some of those key partners, and then has that sort of opened a pathway in any way to be thinking about kind of connecting those funding sources together in different ways? I just was on a, I think, call with one of the federal coordinating councils on mobility, and they mentioned that there's 130, I believe was the number, different funding sources for rural transportation pathways through different agencies and through different homes. So obviously there's a lot of partners and there's a lot of funding streams. I'm just wondering if there's anything that jumps out to you all that you would want to highlight there.
So one of the things we always look for is making sure you have a community champion. So even if you have the funding source, even if the place looks like it's the right place to do this and there's opportunity, you really need to make sure that you have champions in the community that can carry that forward. So I would say that is a key thing. And then also just back to this capacity issue, even if we are letting folks know about what funding is available, it doesn't mean that they have the capacity to actually respond to requests for proposals or these opportunities. And you know, that's something I appreciate about a lot of the work we do is trying to fill in those gaps in capacity so that we do have a level playing field for people to be able to access those different opportunities through a variety of ways.
And have there been key partners beyond the university and the communities themselves that have enabled you to do that a little bit more?
Yes, so I'm sure you're all involved with transportation, so you know the regional development commissions, they're just an incredible asset throughout the state. So appreciate working with the regional development commissions, the initiative foundations, you know, a range of obviously local units of government that can be of value as well. But I think we, you know, have a couple at least in the RDCs and the initiative foundations.
And I'll just wear my MIPTA hat now for a second and just talk about what are we doing as far as like champion, not just community champion, but state champion. Because through MIPTA, we represent, or we work with all of the transit systems throughout the state of Minnesota, greater Minnesota, rural Minnesota. And one thing that we are fortunate, we have an excellent relationship. So when we talk about stakeholders and our partners, we have an excellent relationship with the folks down at MnDOT, the Office of Transit and Active Transportation. And through MIPTA, we have bi-monthly meetings where we discuss funding opportunities, we discuss funding in general, we look at the budget, we have robust discussions on how we can ensure that the transit systems in greater Minnesota and rural Minnesota have funding to provide the services they need to their community. In addition, not just operationally, but then we look at our infrastructure, we look at our vehicles. We try to ensure that we have funding not only for the vehicles, but how do we maintain the vehicles in state of good repair? So yes, we get the funding, we get all the services, we can provide the services on the street, but once again, how do we enhance those services and how do we maintain those services? We have systems in outstate Minnesota that have electric vehicles. Some systems now are actually going with propane vehicles. In St. Cloud, we have natural gas vehicles. And we are taking steps to protect the environment through the partnerships with the folks, for example, down at MnDOT, our federal partners, but also maintaining those infrastructure, maintaining those assets is also important too as well. So continuing to have these important meetings with the folks at MnDOT, important meetings with our state partners, and then also federally working with our Minnesota delegation down at the U.S. Capitol. MIPTA, we have a lot of DC fly-in trips where we go as a team and we meet with folks from both sides of the aisle, and we talk about, we educate them on what we're doing here in Minnesota, What are we doing at Arrowhead Transit? What are we doing in Duluth? What are we doing in Mankato? What are we doing in St. Cloud? Just educate them on upcoming projects, upcoming needs, and just let them know that their dollars are being utilized to not only to protect the environment through the use of efficient vehicles, but also we are taking steps to connect the community to ensure that people have access to transportation. So those meetings are important, those partners are important, and having those discussions bi-monthly and then every 6 months with our federal partners ensure that we could continue to have funding in greater Minnesota, not just for today, but for tomorrow too as well.
So, and I'll talk about, help me remember another entity that we work with too, kind of, you know, a lot of kind of the arms of National Association of Development Organizations is one kind of, you know, they get all the information from their members, their regional members within the area. They've been kind of an instrumental entity that we've worked with. And again, that's kind of folks that come from it from a different viewpoint. The one lady I worked with is an anthropologist. So like her, the way she thinks and stuff, it really kind of, it always makes me think differently about things, right? So I like to work with folks like that can also be, you know, you can even think of your other, like even the Institute of Transportation Engineers, but APWA, kind of ones that might be that overarching they've already kind of gathered some of the folks that you want to reach out to. They can be really beneficial to try to collaborate with. And one of the other entities I'll say is United Way. And I want to give one example, you know, in one of the reports that I've read, it talked about a woman who walked over an hour to get to a meeting because her vehicle needed a repair and it made it inoperable. Right, so walked over an hour. And I know one of the United Ways we worked with realized that this was not just, and these are different United Ways in a different part of the US, this is not just an isolated incident for one state or another. So they created a program where it helped people repair their vehicles so they could be operable again. So thinking about these partners that can help kind of bridge the gap and create these smaller programs that can be very, very impactful for people, I think are some of the more interesting folks that we worked and collaborated with.
Lovely, thank you. Yeah, and I think it's just, it's amazing to see the levels of different partnerships that are available and thinking, one of the things I always think about is just where transportation is in everything. And thinking about where those partners were running the Mobility Access and Transportation and Security program right now, which is a national program. There's going to be a call for rural and small community solutions coming up, and I think that's one of the things that we're thinking about is hospital systems, housers, others who are working with the systems that are connected to transportation but aren't necessarily that's not their main work, also are so critical to the solution. So Kathy, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I would be remiss to mention one partnership, which is my program oversees the university part of the clean energy resource teams, which is actually in and of itself a partnership between the Minnesota Department of Commerce, the Energy Resources, Regional Development Commission, and the Great Plains Institute. And as part of that work, we have an EV success program that's really working on how we tackle the issues for rolling out EVs in greater Minnesota, which has, you know, it's different. It's going to be different in rural Minnesota than it is going to be in the metro. And so that's another important partnership that is associated not just with the university, but with state agencies and those development organizations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ryan, a little bit of a sneak peek with the last video in our Rural Needs series that we're going to be able to share here in the coming weeks is actually with some of your MIPTA partners from Austin, talking about one of their really successful routes is what they call the work route. And it runs, I believe, from 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. and then from 5 a.m. to 9 a.m. And its riders are primarily employees of the major meatpacking spots in Austin, but also just a great example of several other folks being able to take this form of transit that otherwise isn't there if it had not been oriented around the needs of that community, and if the agency hadn't been open to that and championed to that and just said, no, sorry, we run our routes from 9 to 5, right? And that's not what they needed. It's their most popular route, I believe, on that fixed route service. So I imagine there's a lot of peer learning there too with MIPTA of just this has worked for us well here. Yeah. Great. I'm wondering maybe is my last question for you all, and then rather than opening it to the audience, I think what I'm going to do is end a few minutes early and allow people to come up here and grab the great panelists and ask your questions here as we transition into our first set of the concurrent sessions. But maybe just as a wrap-up question here, what do you, and Natalie, you presaged a little of what you're thinking about with the off-road vehicles and some of those challenges there. I'd just be curious from each of you what you're seeing as sort of future-looking issues, what you're thinking about in the work you're doing, what you're maybe most excited about in your upcoming work, or what you've been really wanting to tackle from some of the perspectives we've talked about today.
Gonna put me on the spot first. I mean, I love talking, walking and biking in rural areas, right? And thinking of kind of more of those regional connections. We saw a little bit of that, especially with e-bikes, right? So another thing too is, you know, I like to talk about urban, right? Because there still really is no real great definition of rural. We did some work on that, and some of my colleagues continue that work on it of what do we define as rural besides, you know, sometimes it's what you see, right? And so one other thing that I'm seeing is going back to ATVs, but expanding on that. I think maybe you've seen some youth, seeing some smiles, seeing some youth on e-bikes and what those mean, and are we going to see kind of similar mortality issues with kids kind of operating in our environment without training, and these are moving way faster than kids on bikes, right? And so what does that mean? So I think that's one particular area, but then thinking kind of broadly of connectivity of, you know, that's kind of the negative side of it. The positive side of it is how can we create these connections between rural communities that are in different formats besides vehicular travel to kind of leverage some of these tools that we have where maybe people can travel intra-community, because we know that in rural areas maybe one community has some resources and another one has other resources, but not requiring us to be a vehicular road user or driver to essentially be able to do that and own a vehicle and so forth. So I think that's what I'll offer.
Thanks, Natalie.
I'll just say I'm passionate about transportation, and we all are passionate about transportation. How do we connect communities? You talked about connectivity. How do we utilize the infrastructure that we have in place? So we look at, you go to like Boston, you go to New York City, you see how easy it is to get from the airport to Manhattan. You see how easy it is to get from point A to point B. How can we get from Minneapolis to Duluth? How can we get from Minneapolis to Fargo, Moorhead? How can we get from here, there, quicker? How can utilizing the current infrastructure we have in place? So like we have North Star, for example. How do we take North Star from here and run it up to Fargo, Moorhead? So we could connect not only the rural communities, but we could connect greater Minnesota too. Same concept for Duluth. So I envision a city and a state where we have infrastructure in place where we could connect communities quicker, where people could leave their vehicles at home and utilize our vehicles, whether it's a bus, whether it's a train, just what does that look like? But utilize our infrastructure to get you from point A to point B. And then also, as vehicles become more modern, more efficient, we're looking at autonomous vehicles. Kyle and I, we both serve on the governor's autonomous committee, and we're talking about that. But how can we utilize all this infrastructure? We have the groundwork, we have it in place, but how can we just continue to embrace it and encourage it and utilize it? So that's what I envision for the state of Minnesota. Just connectivity, but faster and efficiently.
And I'll just harken back to, again, Natalie's one of the recommendations she had, which is to be curious. So I do feel that we just need to have the space to listen to both the issues and the innovations that are coming out of rural places so that we can work in partnership with them. And that's one of the reasons I'm very excited to be working on the Empowering Small Communities project with Kyle and with the College of Design and others, that we are really trying to listen and have long-term conversations to spend time in those communities. And it is all around infrastructure and how we can help bring a deep bench of expertise that works together with community champions and find some place-based innovations that can really make an impact. We're at such an interesting time right now. We're facing so many transitions. I sit on the Rural Electric Co-op board, and just our transition of energy sources, for example, and how we're going to roll out EVs. I mean, 85% of the geography of Minnesota is electrified by rural electric co-ops. What does that mean for building out our EV infrastructure? How are we working with those communities around the state? It's just a really interesting time to be curious and come together to see what we can find in terms of where we go next.
Thanks, Kathy, and thanks all. I can't ever hear the phrase "be curious" without hearing it in a Ted Lasso voice now, so I hope I'm not alone with that. Please join me in thanking our panelists and thanking Natalie again for her presentation.